Hello everyone and welcome finally back to the Queer Disrupt podcast. This is the first of an entirely new way that we are doing podcasts at the moment. This is going to be a season, so this is episode 1 of 4, hopefully 5 episodes that will be coming out weekly, which should be really exciting, I think, for everyone to hear. This first season is about BDSM and kind of the queer kind of background and rethinking and re-understanding and kind of thinking through kind of what people would call queer sexual practices, as in non-normative sexual practices throughout. I have an amazing lineup of people that we'll be speaking to throughout the whole season, and they're from academics to people who are involved in practicing in it, all the way through to professional dominatrixes themselves. And yeah, it should just be an absolutely fantastic kind of whirlwind tour of different ways of thinking about BDSM. This first episode, we are joined by Alex Grollemund, who is a PhD student, researcher who specialises in looking at kind of historically damaging queer experiences in the legal system. I'm sure I've butchered that horrifically, but I hope that she'll forgive me, and I believe she explains anyway in the actual podcast episode. But today we're looking at Operation Spanner, which, if you haven't heard of, was a kind of key moment in anti-LGBT legal legislation. With that, I'm hoping to kind of use this as a kind of opening, as a kind of a setting the scene, as it were, for the future conversations. So hopefully you can lay back, shut your eyes and enjoy that we have entitled, for reasons that will become clear, The Butter Knife. Hello and welcome to the brand new Queer Disrupt podcast, as we're doing it into seasons now, which is very exciting. It's all interesting, and this is kind of our first one, which is a little bit of a trial session, so hopefully you'll all love it. So this is the first one of the first one, so absolutely no pressure to my guest, of course, not to stress her out at all here. You can't see it, but she's looking at me with fear and terror in her eyes. I'm kidding, she's not. Or is she? Anyway, this particular podcast is going to be looking at ideas of BDSM, of consent, of what people would call as queer kind of sex practices. And I mean queer there is just non-normative, heavy on the quotation marks there, on normative rather than, like, say, queers and LGBT. So, I am Nick Cherryman. I am one of the founders of Queer Disrupt. I also perform as drag queen IB Profane. Feel free to follow me way on my Insta, IBIPROFANE. I mean, if I've got this platform, I'm using it to promote myself. I'm a working queen. Today, I am joined by Lex, who I'll let introduce herself properly in a moment. And we're going to be talking a little bit in this one, in this first of series of hopefully 5, might be 4, reasons I'll explain in a moment, regarding kind of this kind of BDSM and consent. This has been recorded out of order because that's how production works, as I think I've said in pretty much all of the other ones. So this is actually number 4, and there unfortunately may not be a 5th, but fingers crossed we will do best. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome my fabulous guest. I met her when she presented at the Queer Disrupt conference back in June or July. I've forgotten, considering I organised it. I feel like I should have a better grasp of the timelines here. So I'll pass you over to Lex to introduce herself.
I'm Lex. I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Law at the University of Essex. My research broadly considers consent to harm and to what extent that is legal here in England. I'm specifically looking at the guidelines on what we can and can't consent to as stemming from a seminal House of Lords case here in England in relation to sadomasochism. And this continues almost 30 years on to be the precedent today on what we can and can't consent to when it comes to BDSM, for example, and also things like body modification.
Brilliant, thank you. So first things first, you use the term there, and I ask everyone what we mean by this when it comes up. What do you mean, or at least how are you using the term, in this case, sadomasochism? Normally the question I ask is what do we mean by BDSM, but I think this is a kind of linking question there.
Yeah, sure. So I guess broadly, I will refer to BDSM as taking on its general definition, which is bondage, discipline, domination, submission, sadism, masochism. So I will use it as referring to that general definition. But obviously, these elements can overlap and all become part of each other. But I'm concerned specifically with sadism and masochism, or SM, sadomasochism. So sadism and masochism both concern pain for the purpose of sexual pleasure or just pleasure generally. Sadism meaning pleasure by inflicting pain on somebody else, and masochism as enjoying the infliction of pain on oneself.
Okay, so thank you. Like I said, I ask everyone that. It's kind of really useful to kind of make sure when we have these conversations, I think it's important, actually, not just useful, to make sure we're all on the same page and we all understand what we mean by these kind of very specific terms. Sadism, for example, could mean one thing to one person, it could mean something else. And of course, I've brought you on to have a conversation. A lot of the conversations that we're having there is kind of, you alluded to it, legal definitions. And it's often quite common, I understand. So please do jump in and correct me if I'm wrong. Across the board in all topics ever, the legal definition doesn't often align with the kind of practicing definition, as it were, or even like the academic theoretical definitions that come up. So you mentioned a seminal case. Could you just talk to me, like when was that? Very, very briefly, what was that? And we'll go into it in a bit more detail, but what are we talking about there?
Sure. It's important to note that as far as the law's view on BDSM is concerned, what it's often referred to is basically harm for the purposes of sexual gratification. So I think when I talk about these cases, that's often how they summarize it. And that's important to note that those two definitions are already quite divergent, right? It's the one that I mentioned at the beginning.
Yes, and I think that's really useful to kind of talk about because, as I said, I know I've recorded this a bit out of order, but I know I talk about in some of the later podcasts, it's not just kind of sexual in a kind of a physical way. There's kind of like mental headspaces, and there's kind of pleasure as a kind of an experience overall. I know one of the later podcasts we talk about BDSM, talking about as a way of kind of dealing with chronic pain and how people use that to kind of reconceptualize their understanding of their own kind of lived embodied experience. The legal definition already, from what you've said there, appears to limit it purely to a very specific, I don't know, would you call it reductive? Would you call it overly simplistic? How would you define that?
Well, as I'll get into, it seems to be quite contextual, depending on the year, depending on the judges involved.
Okay, so let's get into it. Like, what is this case?
Sure. So this case comes out of a 10-year Metropolitan Police operation called Operation Spanner. This is really a seminal moment in English queer history that's so often overlooked. So I think in academia and outside academia, this case called R.V. Brown is referred to without large mention of its investigative underpinnings, which was this police operation. So I think it might be best to start with that.
What year was this? Sorry, just so I...
Right. So this police investigation started in the early 80s. It was about 10 years long, so through 1987. It was a Metropolitan Police investigation where the police were concerned with these rings of sadomasochists. But essentially, they were looking for snuff films. So they were looking for films that resulted in deaths. So they were looking for bodies in people's backyards. So they ended up finding videotapes of consensual sadomasochistic sex between gay and bisexual men. Okay, so they thought they were on to something here and thought that they were then going to find something worse than that.
So Joe, just to interject, so I just want to make sure I've understood the context here. The police basically, for whatever reasons, whether or not we agree with the investigation or not, raided a house, found videos and went, oh look, these men are having kinky sex. They must be murderers or equivalent. Is that Is that the kind of vibe that we're going for here?
Exactly. So you have to, I guess, consider. It seems really funny, right? But
I'm
it's
kind of
not.
laughing because of our cry. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's so ludicrous that's the kind of logical leap that the
And
police
it's
went
even
for.
more ludicrous when you consider that this is still the legal precedent today coming out of
Oh, sweet Jesus.
this
Okay, so I keep
investigation.
interrupting you. Just go on, go on.
That's fine. But I think it's important to consider also the cultural context of the time. So you had, very pertinent, the HIV/AIDS epidemic, also Satanic Panic, very pertinent at the time. Yeah, so there was this idea that some of these men had these sadomasochistic rituals as part of these satanic, worship cult sessions or whatever. So the overarching idea was that there was something much more nefarious going on here in the view of the police. You had these serial sex murders linked to sadomasochism, like Dennis Nielsen, for example, that was in the early 80s. There were other concerns about things like child pornography, right? Pedophilia, bestiality. So you had all of these interlinking things that meant that the connotation with sadomasochism was much more nefarious than, what these guys were actually doing.
What were these guys actually doing without being too explicit? But what are we talking like? Was it kind of, a light spanking or what was it?
So it was a range of things, and we're actually not sure of the exact list of offenses. And this is also another interesting thing to note in my research and research prior to mine. There have been freedom of information requests that went to the police, and these were refused, partially on the grounds of, interestingly enough, health and safety. So the idea that this would endanger us as researchers and our health and safety.
This feels like the arguments you have, like violent video games cause people to as if I don't know, you watch someone getting fisted and next thing you know, you're going to go around and just start randomly fisting people in the street or something ludicrous, you know what I mean? This is absolutely ludicrous. So they've raided this house, they found these videos, they think there's something nefarious going on incorrectly, I assume. So what happens then?
So they interviewed, from what I could find, over 100, if not hundreds, of people about these supposed sex rings.
People or men?
Men.
So
Yeah.
is it gay? We're talking about gay men specifically,
yeah.
are we?
Gay
okay,
men.
cool.
Yeah, exactly. Gay and bisexual men. And they found over 84 potential defendants.
What were they charged with?
So they were charged with assault, occasioning actual bodily harm. And I'll get into what that means afterwards, but bodily harm under the Offenses Against the Person Act. But it's important to note that these men made the point that these videotapes were for their own personal use. So they weren't being sold. Nobody went to the police. Nobody was injured. Nobody went to the doctor. Okay. So this is all done in private by consenting adults.
Quite interesting to note there then as well. Then, no one was harmed in any way severe enough for lasting damage. So we're talking, we're not talking broken bones here. We're talking a few bruises, maybe. I mean, we obviously don't know what was in the videos, but no one was hospitalized from this kind of level of violence.
So we do know a little bit. And like I said, it was a range of things, and there were many videotapes. So it ranged from spanking, whipping, to things like piercing of the penis with a fish hook, for example, or somebody nailing somebody's scrotum to a breadboard, for example.
So it is pretty extreme in some regards, but again, we're not. I mean, I've gone back to this example before. We're not talking, and I keep forgetting his name every bloody time. That German cannibal who killed a man and ate him. You know what I mean? We're not talking life-threatening here, as long as people aren't being stupid about it.
Exactly. So that is interesting to note, though, that is also in the law the logical extension of this legal principle that I'll get into that comes out of this seminal case. Things like euthanasia and cases about that, this law has been cited, or this case has been cited. So that's quite interesting. And I'll get into that later. But I'm trying to do this chronologically again.
Sorry, I'm jumping around like a lunatic and blaming you. So we've got 84 defendants.
Yeah. 15 were convicted and found guilty. So first, they had their case heard at the Crown Court at the Old Bailey. All right. And there, Judge Rand, who's the main judge, he said there that the courts must draw the line between what's acceptable in a civilized society and what is not. Making the point that a decision needs to be made about what morality means in terms of sadomasochism, right? So that was in December 1990. So 15 men were convicted and sentenced. And their sentences ranged from 3 years imprisonment to community service, for example. 5 of them went to the Court of Appeal and then went on to the House of Lords. And that case is called R.V. Brown. And this is, like I said, still the seminal precedent when it comes to consent to harm. Okay, so 5 of the men appealed at the House of Lords. And this is the case that when law students study criminal law, it's one of the main things they look at when they study offenses against the person. So things like assault, battery assault, actual and grievous bodily harm. It's so interesting because it draws the line on what we can and cannot consent to in relation to harm. And it established these consent categories. So through detangling what they thought about sadomasochism and if it would be possible to consent to that as a defense. Okay, that's the other important thing, is that they lost the appeal and it was a 3-2 decision, right? So a very close margin. And the 2 dissenting judges considered consent as an element of the offense. So they said, well, hey, if you're going to prosecute somebody for something, you could only do so if it's established that there was no consent involved. But the majority judges considered this as a part of the defense. And this is still the case. And this is tricky because it puts the onus on the defense to demonstrate that a person did in fact consent. So basically the important thing is that consent is considered as an element of the defense rather than the offense. The importance of that is that it puts the onus on the defense to explain consent.
So just so I understand this, what's to prevent then, because I think this does tie into a lot of the themes there, the defense just going, I consented. Surely that's the defense there. It's like, well, exactly. I did consent. So like...
Exactly. In law, when it comes to serious offenses, valid consent can be an effective defense. And that means that it's, of course, expressed or informed consent or implied, right? So that it's effective. However, the R.V. Brown case brings a caveat to that, and that is you cannot consent. And this is the legal principle that Brown established that is so, so important in criminal law today. And that principle is that, no, you in fact cannot consent to harm if it goes above a certain level of harm. And right. If it's not carried out for, quote, good reason.
Right. So then we've got what is that level? What is good reason? What is bad reason? What isn't? Because obviously you can make the argument that tattooing clearly then is viewed as below that threshold, right, and is apparently a good... Right. So all of right. this... So this kind of raiding for snuff films has led to this all the way up in the long scheme of things, as you said in the R.V. Brown case, to this level of what can and can't we do to our own body and consent to having done to our own body. Okay.
So the court admitted that there was no direct legal precedent for this. So it relied on past case law to kind of pick these questions apart. And they admittedly didn't really know what to do. So it ends up in this complicated web of legal reasoning. The one important thing being that, the idea of like, what is this level of harm? Okay, that's the threshold here. So for this, they relied on a 1934 case called R.V. Donovan, saying that harm or risk of harm doesn't need to be permanent, but merely more than transient or trifling.
They're also subjective terms, aren't they? In and of
Exactly.
Like, how long is transient? What does trifling mean? Oh, for heaven's sake.
Exactly. So what does that even mean? Right. And that's then to be further established by case law. But right, transient meaning, okay, it has to be more than lasting just a little while. Trifling meaning that it has to have some kind of significance. So again, what do both of those things truly mean? It's been demonstrated, I think, through case law, though, that they draw the line at basically drawing of blood. So something that requires stitches, for example, could be illegal. Right. So that's one of the most important things here is they said, okay, for anything below that threshold, sure, you might be able to consent to that. For anything above that, can't consent.
So can I just so I understand, is that actually transient and trifling? Because surely a tattoo there crosses that threshold comfortably. The idea that a tattoo is permanent, its definition, it is tattooed into you.
Exactly. So that's the second important part of this, is that they, through this detangling of past law, they said, okay, well, previous cases have established these acceptable categories of things that we have established constitute a good reason for harm. And therefore, these are the exceptions, right? So they said, right, can't consent to anything that's more than transient trifling or risk of transient and trifling, except these consent categories. These include things like ritual circumcision, tattooing, ear piercing, violent sports, of course, like boxing, surgery, of course, chastisement of children, and interestingly enough...
Whoa, sorry, just to jump in there. Hang on. You're allowed to more than transiently and triflingly beat your child as long as it's punishing.
Yes, exactly. So that was included in their... I don't know to what extent that's still the case today, but yeah.
But okay, I just want to make sure I understand where we're holding this kind of sadomasochistic kind of thing in relation to previous cases. Beating your children, okay. Consensual spanking, no. Okay, cool.
Isn't that odd? Yeah. So chastisement of children, and that's not even the oddest one. So the oddest one, I think, is jostling in a crowd was also included in this list.
What?
Jostling in a crowd.
How jostly are people?
Apparently very.
Like a mosh pit or something. I can just imagine the next sale opening at 4 a.m. and people just elbowing each other in the face to get that. That's allowed. Okay.
Black Friday's coming up, isn't it? So you better be well versed in this.
Okay. Okay. At least I know legally where I stand. Oh, hey. 1934. Bring it on.
Exactly.
Okay.
I think, just coming back to this idea of valid consent, though, I wanted to stress that, what sets these men apart from, or these people apart from other consenting or non-consenting, figures as a figure in the law, is this idea that, okay, of course, animals can't consent, children can't consent, cadavers can't consent, mentally incapacitated people, okay? So those kind of people cannot give effective consent. And I think it's important to stress that this case and any of the cases that I'll talk about involve valid consent. So it was established in all of these legal cases, and in any of these situations that I talk about when it comes to sadomasochism, that there is valid consent established.
Well, can I just clarify what we mean there? So by valid consent, do we mean, no, these people were capable and gave consent, or they are viewed as something not, again, quotation, not normal or whatever enough where that consent is no longer valid? So can I just to make sure I understand?
Well, the former, right? So it was established that they gave consent.
What happened then? So we've got this 3-2 kind of decision, and it set this precedent up. What's the fallout from this?
The fallout is anger and serious frustration. Okay. Because going back to the judgment for this case, Lord Templeman, for example, in the majority opinion, and this is one of the main quotes that comes out of this judgment because it just summarizes the view of the majority judges when it comes to sadomasochism. Lord Templeman said, "Society is entitled and bound to protect itself against a cult of violence. Pleasure derived from the infliction of pain is an evil thing. Cruelty is uncivilized." So it goes back to this idea of this as a practice not being civilized, or these men as being involved in this practice being uncivilized. There were repeated references to HIV/AIDS. So Lord Templeman said dangers of blood infection were pertinent here, that several of the men involved with these people died of AIDS, that one of them was at present infected with HIV, but this had not necessarily been from involvement with this group. Made it clear to mention that. This kind of danger of like the free flow of blood around wounds. So there was repeated references to HIV/AIDS. Another one of the judges discussed the possibility of and corruption of young men, right? And the fact that this was a real danger if practices like this were allowed to continue to exist.
So they were basically talking there, the idea of like, oh no, this is going to teach young men the ways of the wicked gay or whatever weird kind of framing, like some sort of...
Exactly. And especially because there were video recordings. So this idea that...
Personal video recordings, to be clear, as you said, personal video recordings, they were not being shared like in any scale that was... Okay.
Exactly. Personal recordings, but the judge made it a point to say that, you know, this could potentially spread with the expansion of media, actually. So that's important now when we consider the rise of online pornography. Okay. So the same kind of idea way back when. And, you know, over and over, these kind of homophobic undertones. So another one of the judges said, SM, homosexual activity cannot be regarded as conducive to the enhancement or enjoyment of family life or welfare of society. And the physical cruelty that it must involve can scarcely be regarded as a manly diversion.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've got this kind of fear of femininity, fear of queerness. I'm just thinking, the second you said welfare of the family, the first thing that came into my head was Section 28 of a pretended family relationship. They can't promote the idea that homosexuality is the idea of a pretended family, acceptable pretended family relationship. I've forgotten the exact wording, but pretended family relationship, I think, is the word. And it's just, you know, it's the idea that, again, the queers or any sort of queer sex, and I use queer not just in an LGBT there, but as kind of a non-normative kind of sex, is somehow damaging to a kind of perceived norm of society, right? The idea that sex takes place for the purpose of reproduction between a man and a woman in a family, and they have 2.4 children and a picket fence and so on and so forth. Okay, so we have kind of got this kind of fallout now. People are understandably pissed off. I can imagine a lot of people didn't really care socially in the grand scheme of things, but at least people this affects, I imagine, were pissed off. People got prison sentences. People got all sorts from this. Okay, and I kind of have two kind of angles and questions for you. The first one is, what kind of questions and difficulties does this case and the precedent set by this case lead to us kind of talking over legal control over the body? You kind of mentioned this kind of idea. I believe there was an example a couple of years after that regarding a husband and a wife with a butter knife, but I'll let you explain that. And the other question is, what does that mean for us now? What are we kind of dealing with? Are we still dealing with this now? From what you've said, I'm going to go with yes, but I'm kind of more curious as to like what extent, because to the best of my knowledge, light spanking and filming it, so I've heard on Pornhub, I've heard people have told me through the grapevine, isn't illegal now. So clearly something has shifted somewhere at some point. So could you just track for me, if it's possible to, I don't know how complicated it is, this kind of shifting landscape there, in particular in relation to kind of what we can and can't consent to with the body, in relation to kind of, again, quotation marks, self-harm, as the legal kind of definition would have put it.
So the 1996 case that you talked about was this case called R.V. Wilson. And there was major uproar, especially after this one, because this concerned a husband and wife. And the husband had branded his wife's bum with his initials. And the court here took a totally different turn and said that this branding was akin to one of these established categories of good reason, which is tattooing. He branded his wife's bum with his initials using the butter knife. And the court found here that this was just akin to tattooing. And also important to note here that she had developed an infection and went to the doctor. So the doctor reported it to police.
Oh, interesting. On what,
so again,
grounds? Like abuse?
Yes, exactly. Assault.
Okay.
Effectively. Okay. But the judge said here, what happens in, and this is a direct quote, like what happens in the marital home is not, for our purposes, a matter of the criminal law to decide.
So
not a direct quote, but yeah. Exactly that.
But basically, so gay people who can't legally get married at this point, to just, if people aren't sure, perhaps outside of the UK, to be clear, was not the case at this point, as well as a massive amount of homophobia in society during the late 80s, well, most of the 80s and the 90s in particular. That's bad, consenting, etc., etc. But marital home branding, that's all okay. And it seems to me, and this isn't a conversation to have right now, but it seems to me he's almost, sounds like rape apologist. It's, as long as that happens in the marital home, it's almost excusing marital rape. But again, that's a conversation for another thing, because I will get very angry, and I imagine you will as well, if we have that conversation.
Again, the judge stressed what happens in the privacy of matrimonial home isn't our concern. But again, important to note here that there was no, quote, victim, in the sense that she didn't report anything. Nobody went to police, no lasting injuries. Okay, she had an infection, but the police referred it to, or the doctor referred it to police. And the judge, interestingly enough, also said, not only did she ask for it, she instigated it. So made it a point to say, oh, this was very clear cut, right?
But how does this differ? So, I mean, this is obviously the question that comes up in where there was uproar, but how on earth does this differ from the police raid finding videos of consenting men? Like, I'm assuming the answer is there isn't really a difference, which is why there was uproar.
Yeah. So here the appeal was accepted, and that's where we get into the Brown case and three of these defendants referring their case to the European Court of Human Rights. And this was in 97. So at the European Court of Human Rights, they were confronted with Wilson. And the question was, well, hey, how come these two very divergent judgments? Also in their tones, right?
Yeah, because they're wildly divergent, actually, for very similar. It's cool. Okay.
Absolutely. Wildly divergent. And they appealed to the European Court on the basis of their right to privacy. The appeal was dismissed on the grounds of public health. The idea that this could, if permitted on a wide scale, could be grounds for a public health emergency, right?
But not the butter knife.
Not the butter knife, no.
That's going to be the title of this episode, not the butter knife.
Not the butter knife. Yeah.
Not the butter knife.
Yeah. So when confronted with these two cases, the court said, well, they're really different in terms of seriousness. And it's kind of like, well, which acts were they looking at specifically and what were they comparing? Surely they weren't comparing a straight married couple in the privacy of their own home to gay and bisexual men in larger groups. There was a 1999 case called R.V. Emmett that again involved a husband and wife consenting BDSM stuff. He put a bag over her head at one point, and she lost consciousness, and she had bloodshot eyes and went to the doctor afterwards as a result of this. And then on a second occasion, the husband had poured lighter fluid on her chest and lit her on fire. She again had an infection, went to the doctor referred it to police. And so this is another similar case. And here the appeal was dismissed on the grounds that this was, in fact, severe enough to constitute more than transient and trifling injury. But it's interesting that this came right after the European Court of Human Rights case that very much referenced this question of homophobia. Were they making up for a terrible previous judgment, right, to kind of reconcile?
Right, okay. Where are we now then in regards to this particular kind of the legal fallout of this, and I guess more interestingly in terms of the podcast moving forward, we've set up this kind of legal kind of background here, right, in the UK. What does this mean for people now? And what does this mean for people's ability to consent I'm recording in 2021 at the minute, November, but this will be aired in early 22, I think. So with that kind of timeline, unless something massively drastic happens over the next couple of months that neither of us can foresee, where are we?
So the CPS Guidelines, that's the Crown Prosecution Service guidelines on offences against the person. So they still reference Brown in relation to when a victim's consent is a defence to a charge. So this means that sadomasochism is still effectively illegal when it comes to assault that involves battery that's more than transient or trifling, right? So it's still the precedent case in this area. Interestingly enough, this was just codified in law, so in statute, whereas before this was just case law, right? So the precedent was this case law, R.V. Brown. This year, in April, this legal principle was codified. So it became actual law as part of the Domestic Abuse Act, 2021, almost 30 years later.
So they are now equating this sort of behaviour with domestic abuse in 2021. That's the kind of the framework they're holding this conversation within. It is at least comparable or worthy of having a discussion of consenting sexual practice that may be, quote, more than transient or trifling, up there with domestic abuse. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes. So obviously the domestic abuse bill that received royal assent and became the Act 2021. It's well intended. So it aims to counter sexual violence. It created a statutory definition of domestic abuse. It prohibits perpetrators of abuse from cross-examining victims. It extended coercive behavior to cover post-separation abuse.
The precedent itself is well-meaning, as you said it. I think no one is denying the examples you listed there are worthy of being codified in law, right? Don't abuse people, frankly. I think the problem is, though, these actions are being lumped into that same category as these, frankly, awful behaviours. The idea that spanking someone is equivalent to, say, revenge porn or kind of sexual stalking or the ability to cross-examine someone by an abuse. You know what I mean? Surely, sorry, I'm confused because in my mind I can't equate the two. That's why I'm like, what?
And it is in fact a weird conflation of things. And it's important to note again where this comes from. And it stems from basically the supposed rise in use of the rough sex defense by defendants in homicide cases, where defendants claim that the death of a partner was caused in the course of rough sex that went wrong.
So to use an example, a hypothetical example, but I imagine it's been real. This person was really into choking. Oh, let's go back to that example of the woman in 99. Put a bag over her head. She's really into that. He accidentally kills her, and his defense would be she's really into that kind of thing. This was just an accident that got out of control. There was no actual attempt to murder her, I'm guessing, to kind of extrapolate a defense from that. Is that correct?
That's the supposed claim, but legally speaking, there isn't actually a rough sex defense, and that's been the contention when this has been claimed, and that's underpins part of the problem with this. There wasn't a rough sex defense to begin with, and the campaign group that arose around this idea of, well, we can't consent to our own death, was called We Can't Consent to This. So it's basically, this feminist campaign that argues that by extension, we can't consent to our own death, right, as women through rough sex.
I was going to say specifically because I'm curious, what are their views on euthanasia? Just so I understand.
Their main point is we can't consent to death by extension of consenting to rough sex.
Okay, so they were talking kind of specifically within a kind of sexual framework.
Specifically relating to this rise in the use of this supposed rough sex defense and this being all over the media.
I imagine, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this disproportionately affected women in heterosexual relationships. Well, when I say that, I mean like women are the ones who were the victims and men are the ones who are using the rough sex defense cue.
Exactly. Yeah. It always concerns men using this defense and women being the victims.
Which is nearly always the kind of balance of domestic violence and so on and so forth, which makes the context of the April 21 codification, again, a bit more understanding where it comes from. But so MPs get involved. They start supporting this. They say, we are going to make sure to codify the principle from Brown in law as part of, this act. What a great opportunity. And so you have this weird little caveat as part of this instrument that's focused for the most part on consent and the importance of consent. So you have this caveat that says, but consent isn't important when it comes to infliction of serious harm. But again, what does that mean? That then goes back to the rules from Brown. So this is making me think of, and kind of steering me wildly back on track if I'm straying off. It was a few years ago. There was a whole series of face-sitting protests outside. So the reason I'm looking at this is, how is that not transient and trifling if there's no lasting damage? And for obvious reasons, assuming the person lives, which is obviously the plan, trifling. I'm just trying to get my head around it, because this just seems so wildly inconsistent across the board. I can't figure it out.
Right. So this is a whole nother thing, which is concerned with extreme pornography or pornography generally. So the depiction of SM. And it used to be the case that although certain sexual practices were legal when, done in the privacy of your own home, the depiction of certain things was still in fact illegal.
Why?
This goes back to the Obscene Publications Act. So anything that was thought to deprave or corrupt society could be considered obscene.
Okay, so I think there's something just the part that's really interesting on the idea of like what acts are viewed as depraved, obscene.
Right. So there were two really important cases on this in 2012. One was called Peacock and one was called Walsh. And in the Peacock trial, there was a male escort, Michael Peacock, who basically filmed himself and his clients and sold DVDs.
So with their consent or not?
With their consent.
Okay.
And the videos were depicting whipping, stage kidnapping, rape play, fisting, urination, between gay men, and so violent scenes, right, including also a man being punched in the testicles. So the jury had to watch these videos and determine...
Oh, lucky them.
Yeah, exactly. Hours and hours of this. And the question was, well, did they think that, under this Obscene Publications Act, would these films deprave or corrupt a viewer? And he was found actually not guilty. And this was kind of this seminal moment that in essence, overturned this idea of what is depraved or corrupt now, 20 years on from Spanner, and the depiction of images of sex rather than just what can and can't be consented to.
So Operation Spanner being the police raids.
Yeah.
That was the nickname of that. I realise we haven't said that yet. But Operation Spanner is what we call that kind of police raiding. Okay. So the Operation Spanner is what launched this, what has now been a long conversation on just the shit show fallout.
Yeah, then we have Walsh, and this is basically this anal fisting case where this barrister, actually an aide to Boris Johnson, was charged with possession of extreme porn. So not creation, but possession of. And this involved in part anal fisting. And it was again the question of, well, fisting is legal to, carry out yourself. Can you depict it on video? And again, here he was found not guilty.
Fisting is allowed to be kind of filmed and circulated. Is that what this is? Or
exactly.
Is it just...
So previously, you could not depict certain things that were perfectly legal to carry out, in private, in your own sexual relations or whatever. But this kind of overturned that. So now you could depict anything that was legal in person. But this, again, doesn't include things that go above that line of transient and trifling. So it still relies on the Brown logic. So by extension, you could not depict in pornography anything that went above or could risk going above this level of transient and trifling. So you still couldn't depict...
the face-sitting because there's the risk of it going
for the face
above.
sitting.
Right.
So these face sitting protests then surround this rise of video on demand and the need to regulate that in a way. So it was at VOD, so this authority for television on demand, that was this industry body designated by Ofcom as the regulator for this video on demand. It concerned online paid for video porn needing to be the same as DVDs when it comes to law.
What does that mean in practice? Sorry, just so I don't understand the difference. Sorry.
So anything that was illegal to be depicted on DVDs, sold at shops, needed to be the same guidelines as online paid for video porn.
So that would include, I'm using an extreme here, like a real death, for example.
So these audiovisual media service regulations from 2014 concerned basically banning sex acts that were deemed life-threatening. So strangulation, face-sitting, fisting.
Fisting is seen as life-threatening.
Yep. But autoerotic asphyxiation, for example, was okay when a woman was maybe gagging on an erect penis, for example. That was totally fine.
Well, okay. Well, I'm sorry. Mind-boggling here. How fragile is the masculinity of society that the thought of a woman actually ejaculating is seen as a threat enough to fucking ban it?
Exactly. Also, when female ejaculation was fine. Or male ejaculation.
Yeah, male ejaculation is allowed because that's
male ejaculation.
God forbid the woman enjoy herself.
Yeah. So why does society?
So for the listeners, I've just had my head in my hands for the past 20 minutes. I know you can't see this, but like Lex keeps pausing, so I think she's genuinely a bit concerned about me. But like, this is just mind-boggling. So you can, without getting too crude about it's going to get crude, we're talking about porn. So you can essentially have a violent face fucking where someone's gagging and vomiting and all of this kind of quite violent, quotation marks, however you want to view that kind of situation. You can have spanking of some sorts. You can have erotic asphyxiation, which I mentioned in the later one, but and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is the idea of kind of the restriction of oxygen of oneself whilst masturbating. So an example there would be tying a rope around one's neck and pulling it taut whilst masturbating. The idea being then to heighten the orgasm when or if it comes. But God forbid a woman orgasms and ejaculates.
This also disproportionately targeted the queer community.
Yeah.
When it came to things like fisting, for example.
Okay. My mind is boggled. I might actually take a break for a second. This is insane. Okay. Like if I was to go onto Pornhub and search fisting or even face sitting.
Yeah. So these guidelines, these are also the CPS guidelines, the Prosecution Services guidelines, have been since updated, of course, when it comes to extreme porn.
To what?
Yeah. So guidelines about what constitutes obscene porn have been relaxed. The CPS admittedly said that it's not for it to decide what's considered good taste or objectionable. So they admitted to that. So previously, things like sadomasochism, torture, bondage, urinating, defecating, these were things that were listed in the guidelines as being not okay. And this has changed now to be focused more on things that surround consent. So basically they say that things that aren't okay are, again, things that could constitute serious injury or pose a risk of serious injury to a person's anus, breasts, or genitals, anything that threatens a person's life, something that involves interference with a corpse, or an animal. All right, so those are the things that are now big no-nos. The rest, they're not going to comment on. It's not for them to decide what's considered good taste when it comes to extreme pornography. So these were previously legal to perform, but not legal to depict, and now it's all right. Things like BDSM.
Right. Okay. So,
but there's still the threshold of the Brown ruling. So extreme pornography or extreme pornography that you perform in your own home is still illegal if it goes above that threshold, arguably, of transient and trifling. And again, the fact that this was now included in this Domestic Abuse Act in the way it was concerns me, because my problem with this is that you're effectively relegating consent, right? So you're negating consent in a discussion that's premised on validating consent as the distinguishing factor to identify sexual violence. So to identify sexual violence from otherwise consensual activity. And of course, as we know, in BDSM encounters, consent is important, but it's negotiated, it's unclear. So I think, like, rather than engage in a discussion around consent and the myriad forms that this takes, this blanket statement in the law of we can't consent, and that takes hold for obviously well-intentioned purposes, but there's like no nuanced way to go about it. And in turn, we've doubled down on this obsolete legal principle that was established for arguably all the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
In this context of homophobia, satanic panic, etc.
So to give an example there, what we mean by kind of consent being negotiable is you can negotiate how far I'm prepared to go with something. I might consent to rape play, for example, but I might not consent to rape play with a knife. To give a kind of extreme example like that, well, not even that extreme actually, just to give an example there. Or I might consent to bondage in some ways, but not in others, and so on. I might consent to bondage being tied up, but I might not consent to bondage around my neck. But the point there is, for example, you can't just blanketly go, no bondage.
Well, it's like, how on earth could the law ever reflect the nuance of that? And my thinking through my project is that it, of course, cannot ever. And admittedly, these judges have said this is so difficult to detangle. But surely the answer is not to just completely relegate consent, in my opinion. I think these cases should be addressed on a case-by-case basis. Okay, and the context should be considered.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't know enough about the law to comment, but from what you said there, that sounds extremely reasonable to me. I can't see a problem with that. But that kind of brings me to kind of where I was kind of getting to with this. I remember a while back, completely unrelated conversation. I was chatting to someone on my course who does law, and I've even forgotten what I was talking about. But I remember she basically just went, "This is a nightmare," and I was like, "I don't understand. Like, what's the law? Just tell me what the law is, so I know what the law is, based on something moving forward." And she went, "No, it's not as simple as that." And I was like, "How is it not as simple as that? What does it say in law?" And then she was like, "Well, we've got this case here, you got this kind of judgment here, this precedent here." And I was like, "Huh?" And she was like, "Yeah, this is just what the law is. The law is just a tangled web that you are constantly picking through to try and find a way. And sometimes some bits stick more than others." And I feel like this is very much what has happened here. It feels like there's a mixture between kind of social and cultural fear that has kind of presented various kind of laws and cases that haven't progressed past literally the 1930s in some cases here, all the way up to where we're at now, where we have so many cases, so many cultural differences from kind of mixture between kind of homophobia or queerphobia, if I'm going to be more kind of general about it, but queerphobia tied in with these weird rulings that have been codified in such as civilized society, different consent categories, what isn't allowed, all the way up to bizarre levels of codified sexism. And what we're left with is this mess that we're desperately trying to negotiate constantly when engaging in consenting sexual practice. And how do we kind of work within these frameworks and these kind of, as you said, these complicated and I think you hit the nail on the head there with nuanced scenarios. So I guess for those reasons, I can have all of these questions, but I don't think there will be answers. So the kind of questions I kind of want to ask from this moving forward for kind of future podcasts are, to what extent do we have legal control over the body? What extent do we have of a legal control of the body generally, but also within these kind of specific sexual practices? And I'm not going to ask, you can feel free if you want to kind of feedback on that, but I'm not going to ask you to feedback on that, because what I kind of want to do is I want the listeners to kind of reflect and think about this for the next kind of episodes moving forward. And what dictates our understanding over legal control? What cultural conversations have dictated what isn't allowed in those? So the questions I'm asking there are not to kind of be provocative, but to reflect, I guess, as an academic exercise in some regards, where do we draw those lines? And what are the knock-on effects of these in regards to things like euthanasia, things such as elective surgery that may or may not be kind of medically necessary? To use an example that I don't agree with, but I've heard many people argue, is for example, a voluntary mastectomy for trans men medically necessary? Now, my argument there would be yes, because of the mental impact that's kind of attached to that. But otherwise, are these things kind of necessary? And these are, for some of you and for me, some of the questions I've asked have very clear answers in my mind. And I hope you can appreciate I'm deliberately not kind of setting my kind of statement on this for the reasons that I want to complicate these questions. I think that's probably a good point to stop, given that you've given us an absolutely incredibly comprehensive breakdown of just things happening. The look on Lex's face there, I was like, oh no, I was like, no, this is good. No, this is what we wanted. It sets that precedent moving forward. It gives us a kind of a framework of understanding of the legal and cultural and social kind of background which these conversations are taking place in. And I think there's something really interesting that I'm speaking as someone who has kind of produced, co-written, written basically a lot of the kind of frameworks of this, organized and produced this entire podcast. I wasn't aware of some of this stuff. So again, we've got this kind of, what is these things in practice versus the actual kind of legal and things that are framing these conversations and the disconnect between them. I'll pause there. I mean, have you got anything to feedback on or anything you'd like to kind of say towards the end there and kind of framework on, or, I mean, over to you to kind of any final comments?
I think it's just, as we move forward, considering especially this new law, it's important to reflect on the historical impetuses of these regulations and these laws and the historical context of where these laws come from and who made these decisions and for what reasons. And, you know, they're very consequential implications down the line, you know, and moving forward as we continue to make laws that guide sexual liberty and restrict sexual liberty, to be mindful of the reasons that we're making those decisions. And I would advise, especially because of this new law, caution on the part of practitioners. You know, there might be no prosecutions under this new law, but I would continue to advise caution, I think, because BDSM is effectively still illegal in parts, which is terrifying. I also wonder if there will be an activist response, to be honest, going forward because of these new laws. I think we might hear some outcry on the part of practitioners. I would hope so, actually.
What do we want? Fisting. When do we want it? Now.
Exactly.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I hope you have enjoyed it. So
absolutely.
Yeah, we'll wrap up there. Thank you very much. And yeah, we'll catch you for the next episode, hopefully. Cool. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye. Wow, I really enjoyed that. I hope you did as well. Tell us what you think. Leave any comments, drop us any messages, share on social media. Let us know what your thoughts are on this. Join us next week, though, when I am talking to Lucy Sweetkill, a New York-based dominatrix, who is going to be in discussion with me regarding ethical domination. How do we engage with BDSM in actual practice rather than just in kind of academic theoretical frameworks there? It's an absolutely incredible conversation, and that is up next week. Until then, make sure you follow us on all of our social media. We are Queer Disrupt on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and so on. Let us know what your thoughts are. Feel free to share the podcast. Let us know what your thoughts are there, and we will catch you next week.